In the heart of the climax, where betrayal's blade hovered perilously close, Isabel MacLeod pressed her palm against Etienne Blackwood's chest, feeling the thunderous rhythm of his heart betray the stoic facade of the Shadow King. The grand hall of Rivermont Palace echoed with gasps as her ex-lover's venomous accusations unraveled their fragile deception, forcing Isabel to choose between fleeing into obscurity or claiming the throne, and the man she never intended to love. Shadows coiled like living serpents around them, the king's magic flaring in protective fury, as the court held its breath for the revelation that would either doom or deliver them. If this pivotal confrontation has your pulse racing with anticipation, smash that like button now. It signals you crave more tales of destiny-defying romance, and I'll deliver worlds where hearts conquer shadows. The city was built on layers, stone atop stone, truth buried beneath convenience. From above, it looked orderly. Narrow streets braided with lantern light, spires rising like watchful sentinels, and banners fluttering to suggest unity. But beneath the surface, the city breathed differently. It whispered. Those whispers slipped through alleyways and under doors, curling into the cracks of old buildings and older loyalties. They spoke of vanished people, altered records, quiet deals made at dusk. Most citizens learned early not to listen. Listening invited questions, and questions invited attention. The protagonist had learned that lesson too late. They moved carefully through the twilight streets, hood drawn low, not to hide their face, but to dull their presence. In this city, invisibility was not achieved by absence, but by blending seamlessly into the expected. A measured pace, neutral posture, eyes forward, never lingering too long on anything that mattered. Inside, however, nothing was neutral. A tight knot of worry sat just below the ribs, growing heavier with every step. It wasn't fear alone. Fear had become familiar, but the deeper unease of knowing something fragile was slipping away. Safety, belonging, the illusion that endurance was enough. The protagonist had once believed that if they stayed quiet, if they followed the rules closely enough, the city would leave them untouched. That belief had been worn thin by recent weeks. Patterns had emerged, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. A name crossed out in a registry. A coded warning delivered by someone who wouldn't meet their eyes. A door that had always been open, now locked without explanation. And then there was the silence. Silence from the one place they expected answers. The Vale House stood at the edge of the old quarter, half forgotten by the city's expansion. Its windows were dark, its stonework eroded by decades of neglect. Most people passed it without noticing, or with a faint shiver they couldn't explain. Officially, it was a historical relic. Unofficially, it was a threshold. The protagonist stopped across the street, heart pounding. They had no proof that what they sought was inside. Only fragments, rumors stitched together from overheard conversations and half-finished sentences. Whispers in the veil. As a child, they had been warned never to come here. Nothing good answers when you call from that place, someone had once said. And if something does answer, it never gives without taking. That warning echoed now, louder than ever. The protagonist felt profoundly alone. Not in the dramatic sense of abandonment, but in the quiet, exhausting way that comes from realizing no one else can make the choice for you. Friends had drifted away, not out of malice, but fear. Institutions had closed ranks. Even the city itself seemed to push back, as though rejecting the idea that one small person could disturb its balance. Isolation pressed in from every direction. Yet isolation also clarified things. There was no one left to ask for permission. The protagonist crossed the street. Each step toward the Vale House felt like crossing an invisible boundary. The air seemed denser, charged with something unnamed. The sounds of the city softened, Footsteps muffled, voices distant, as though the world itself was holding its breath. At the door, they hesitated. This was the moment where turning back was still possible, where denial could be reclaimed, and the slow erosion of certainty accepted as the cost of survival. Many people lived that way. Many people lasted longer because of it. But lasting was no longer enough. The protagonist raised a hand, then let it fall. Their courage didn't arrive as a sudden surge of bravery. It came as exhaustion. The deep, bone-weary realization that doing nothing was its own kind of danger. That waiting had become riskier than action. They knocked. The sound was softer than expected, swallowed almost immediately by the thick wood. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then another. The protagonist considered knocking again, when the door opened just enough to reveal darkness within. A voice emerged from that darkness, calm, measured, unreadable. "You're not supposed to be here." The words were not hostile, but they were final. A statement of fact. "I know," the protagonist replied, surprised at the steadiness of their own voice. "That's why I came." Silence stretched between them. The door did not open further, but it did not close. Somewhere inside, something shifted, fabric brushing stone. A quiet exhale. "You should leave," the voice said, "before you're seen." "I've already been seen," the protagonist said, "just not by the right people." That was the truth stripped bare. They explained not everything but enough. Carefully chosen words, revealing vulnerability without surrender. They spoke of records that didn't match reality, of warnings disguised as kindness, of a growing sense that the ground beneath their life had been quietly rearranged. Most importantly, they admitted what they didn't know. "I don't understand what's happening," the protagonist said, "but I know it's bigger than me, and I know I won't survive it alone." This was the bold request, though it hadn't been phrased as one yet. It hovered in the air, fragile and exposed. The voice from within the Veil House did not respond immediately. When it did, there was a new edge to it, not suspicion but assessment. "You're asking for answers," the voice said. "I'm asking for truth," the protagonist replied, "or at least a way to stop pretending it doesn't exist." Another pause. Then slowly the door opened wider. Light from the street spilled into the interior, revealing just enough to hint at depth. Corridors receding into shadow, walls lined with markings that were not decorative. The protagonist felt the weight of the threshold press against them. "Once you step inside," the voice said, "you won't be able to unhear what you learn. The veil exists for a reason." The protagonist swallowed. "I'm already hearing things," they said. "I just don't know how to listen." That was the moment everything shifted. The door opened fully. The Veil House welcomed them not with warmth, but with acknowledgement. The protagonist stepped forward, heart racing, fear still present, but now braided with resolve. They did not know what they would lose by entering. They only knew what they would lose by staying outside. Behind them, the city continued its careful performance of order and silence. Ahead, the whispers grew clearer, not louder but sharper, and for the first time the protagonist chose to hear them. Crossing the threshold of the Veil House did not feel like entering a sanctuary. It felt like stepping into a negotiation already in progress, one that had been waiting for the protagonist long before they knew how to ask for help. The interior was larger than it appeared from the outside, its corridors layered with intention. Lanterns glowed faintly along the walls, their light refracted through glass etched with symbols that shifted when viewed directly. Nothing here was ornamental. Everything had a purpose, even if that purpose remained deliberately obscured. The protagonist followed the sound of measured footsteps deeper inside, acutely aware of their own presence. Each step echoed too loudly, as though the house itself were listening. Their fear had not vanished. It had simply recalibrated. This was no longer the fear of being hunted, but the fear of choosing the wrong ally. They were led into a circular chamber where the air felt warmer, charged. At its center stood a long table of dark wood, worn smooth by time and use. Around it sat figures whose faces were partially hidden by shadow, not masked, but positioned carefully, as if anonymity itself were a kind of armor. These were not saviors. They were observers, negotiators, keepers of inconvenient truths. The one who had spoken at the door stood apart from the rest, closer now. Their presence was calm but unreadable, marked by an intelligence that seemed to measure outcomes several steps ahead. They did not offer comfort or reassurance. Instead, they offered clarity. "You've come asking for truth," they said. "Truth is not free." The protagonist nodded. They had expected this. Nothing in the city came without cost. "What do you want in return?" they asked. A subtle exchange passed between the figures at the table, glances, micro-expressions, decisions made without words. The protagonist sensed that this moment was less about whether they would be helped, and more about whether they were useful. "We want access," the speaker said finally. "You move through spaces we cannot. You are overlooked. That makes you valuable." The word landed heavily. The protagonist had spent so long feeling invisible that hearing it reframed as power was disorienting. They resisted the instinct to bristle. Instead, they listened. The bargain took shape slowly, piece by piece. The Vale House would provide fragments of information, guidance disguised as riddles, warnings delivered too late to feel like mercy. In return, the protagonist would act as a conduit. They would observe, report, and occasionally intervene when asked. No oaths, no blood, no written contracts, just implication. "This isn't alliance," the protagonist said carefully. "It's leverage." A faint smile crossed the speaker's face. Not denial, but appreciation. "All alliances begin as leverage," they replied. "Trust comes later. Sometimes." That honesty was unsettling and oddly reassuring. As the term settled, the protagonist became aware of another presence in the room. Someone standing slightly apart from the others, leaning against the stone wall with an air of studied detachment. They had not spoken, but their attention was unmistakable. When their eyes met the protagonist's, something shifted. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was recognition. This figure seemed different from the rest, less entrenched, less certain. Their posture suggested both confidence and restraint, as though they were holding themselves back from stepping fully into the role assigned to them. When they finally spoke, their voice carried a subtle undercurrent of challenge. "You understand this may fail," they said. "That the house doesn't protect what it can't control." "I understand," the protagonist replied. "But I also understand that you're already involved." A flicker of surprise crossed the figure's face, quickly masked. The moment passed, but it lingered in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that neither of them was entirely aligned with the house's intentions. This was the attraction. Not romance, but tension, a pull born of shared skepticism, of standing too close to something dangerous to pretend neutrality. The bargain was sealed without ceremony. No handshakes, no declarations, just a quiet agreement that could be undone as easily as it was made. As the meeting dissolved, the protagonist was given their first fragment of truth. A name they weren't supposed to recognize, a place they weren't supposed to visit. The information felt deliberately incomplete, sharpened to provoke action rather than understanding. "Why not tell me everything?" the protagonist asked. The original speaker's gaze was steady. "Because if you knew everything, you'd never agree to help us." That answer followed them as they were guided back toward the exit. The figure from the wall walked beside them now, silent until they reached the outer corridor. There, away from listening ears, they paused. "Be careful," they said quietly. "The house collects debts it never names." "Are you warning me?" the protagonist asked. "Or protecting yourself?" A moment passed. Then, almost imperceptibly, the figure smiled. "Both," they said. The door to the Vale House opened again, releasing the protagonist back into the city's night air. The streets looked the same as before, orderly, indifferent, but something had shifted. They were no longer alone. They were also no longer free. Behind them, alliances had formed, fragile, conditional, and threaded with secrets. Ahead, the path narrowed, illuminated by partial truths and shadowed motives. And somewhere between suspicion and trust, a connection had sparked, one that would complicate everything that followed. The bargain was enchanted not because it promised safety, but because it worked. For now, the alliance, once formed, did not announce itself with urgency. It unfolded instead through routine, measured, deliberate, almost deceptively mundane. Preparation, the Vale House insisted, was the true point of no return. The protagonist was given instructions in fragments. Not orders exactly, but suggestions weighted with expectation. Places to be at specific hours. Names to listen for without reacting. Objects to notice but not touch. The work was subtle by design, meant to blend seamlessly into the rhythms of the city. It was harder than it sounded. Every task required restraint. The protagonist had to relearn how to move through familiar spaces with unfamiliar intent. Markets they had once crossed absent-mindedly now became networks of observation. Casual conversations carried double meanings. Even silence felt active, charged with consequence. They kept notes at night, coded, incomplete, written more to organize thought than preserve fact. The Vale House had warned against records. "Memory is safer," they had said. "It leaves fewer traces." Still, the weight of knowing pressed heavily. Truth, even in fragments, had mass. Their primary point of contact emerged gradually. The figure who had stood apart during the initial bargain appeared again and again, sometimes by design, sometimes by coincidence that felt too precise to be accidental. They trained together in quiet rooms tucked behind unmarked doors. They reviewed plans that were less strategies than contingencies. Nothing here was guaranteed. The interactions were restrained, professional, and edged with caution. Trust was not assumed. It was tested in small, incremental ways. The figure asked questions that seemed casual but were carefully calibrated. The protagonist answered honestly, but selectively. Both understood the game being played. Yet beneath the measured exchanges, something else took shape. It surfaced in moments of pause, when a plan ended early, or when a task was delayed by circumstance. In those gaps, conversation drifted from logistics to observation. The city, its habits, its blind spots, shared frustrations surfaced, not as complaints, but as recognition. They discovered a mutual attentiveness to details others overlooked, a tendency to listen more than speak, a shared understanding that survival in the city depended less on strength than on timing. Empathy grew not from confession, but from alignment. During one preparation session, the protagonist made a small mistake, misreading a signal, arriving moments too late. The consequences were minor, but the error lingered. They expected reprimand. Instead, the figure paused, considering. Next time, they said, trust what you notice first. Doubt comes later. It was not instruction so much as insight. The protagonist absorbed it with quiet gratitude. As the days passed, proximity increased. Assignments overlapped. Routes crossed. The city, once vast and isolating, narrowed around their shared objectives. With each successful exchange, the unspoken bond tightened, not because they relied on each other, but because they chose to. Still, boundaries remained intact. Neither spoke of the house's deeper motives. Neither asked about past allegiances. The silence around those topics was mutual and intentional. There were truths neither was ready to name, let alone share. The unspoken sparks lived there in restraint. In one moment, standing beneath a broken archway as rain softened the sounds of the street, the figure glanced at the protagonist with an expression that held both curiosity and concern. It passed quickly, replaced by focus, but it lingered in the protagonist's awareness. This was dangerous territory, not because of attraction, but because connection complicated judgment. The Vale House noticed the shift. Assignments grew more pointed. Preparations edged closer to action. The protagonist was tested with scenarios that required decisiveness, not just observation. Each success tightened the house's hold, even as it sharpened the protagonist's confidence. You're adapting quickly, one of the house's voices remarked during a debrief. Faster than expected. The protagonist recognized the subtext. You're becoming invested. They did not deny it. Commitment, once abstract, began to crystallize. The work was no longer theoretical. It affected real people, some complicit, some unaware. The lines between right action and necessary action blurred, forcing the protagonist to confront their own limits. In quiet moments, they found themselves wondering not whether they would continue, but how far they were willing to go. The figure noticed the shift before the protagonist named it themselves. You're thinking ahead, they said during a late review. That's good, but don't let the future pull you out of the present. And you? The protagonist asked. What pulls you out? A pause. Memory, the figure said simply. It was the closest they came to revealing anything personal. The restraint in that admission carried weight. The protagonist did not press. That night, as the city settled into its uneasy sleep, the protagonist realized something unsettling. Preparation had changed them. They were no longer reacting to threat. They were anticipating it. The Vale House had given them tools, but it had also reshaped their instincts. And through it all, one constant remained, the quiet presence beside them, a steady counterpoint to the house's calculated distance. Someone who understood the cost of preparation without glorifying it. The unspoken sparks did not flare. They warmed instead, slow and contained, adding depth to every shared silence. The veils were lifting, not all at once, but enough to reveal the shape of what was coming. Commitments had been made, even if they were never spoken aloud. And once made, they could not be undone. The archives lay beneath the city like a second foundation, older, quieter, and far less forgiving. Reaching them required permissions that no longer existed and routes that had been deliberately erased from public record. The Vale House framed the task as routine, but the tension beneath their instructions suggested otherwise. This was not merely another preparation. This was exposure. The protagonist descended the narrow stairwell with measured steps, aware that each level stripped away more than light. The air grew cooler, tinged with dust and something metallic, Ink, perhaps, or the residue of time itself. Lanterns embedded in the walls flickered to life as they passed, responding not to motion but to presence. The figure moved beside them, silent as always, but closer than usual. Not out of caution, out of necessity. The archives demanded proximity. Their corridors branched unpredictably, rearranging themselves in subtle ways meant to disorient anyone who entered without purpose. "This place remembers," the figure said quietly, "even when the city pretends it doesn't." The protagonist felt that truth settle heavily. They had come seeking answers. What they had not admitted, even to themselves, was the fear of what kind. The chamber they reached was circular and low-ceilinged, its walls lined with shelves carved directly into the stone. No titles marked the spines of the volumes stored there. Identification, the Vale House had once said, was a luxury reserved for those who already knew what they were looking for. The figure gestured toward a narrow table at the center. "This is where things stop being theoretical," they said. The first record the protagonist uncovered was not about the city, nor the Vale House, nor any grand conspiracy. It was about someone like them, someone overlooked, useful, quietly erased. The details were familiar in unsettling ways. A timeline that echoed their own experiences. Decisions made without consent. Outcomes framed as necessity. The protagonist's breath caught. "This isn't coincidence," they said. "No," the figure replied. "It's pattern." Piece by piece, the truth emerged. Not all at once, but enough to reshape everything that came before. The Vale House had not simply reacted to threats. It had cultivated them. It identified people with specific traits, adaptability, invisibility, moral hesitation, and placed them where pressure would eventually force compliance. The protagonist was not chosen because they were exceptional. They were chosen because they were predictable. The realization struck harder than any external danger. It reframed their courage, their desperation, even their defiance. Had those choices truly been their own, or merely anticipated? The figure watched them closely now, the careful distance between them finally giving way. "There's more," they said. "But this is where it becomes personal." From a hidden compartment, they retrieved a final record, older, thinner, handled often enough to have softened its edges. They did not pass it over immediately. "This one," they said, "is about me." The admission hung in the air. They spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. Of a past shaped by similar recruitment. Of believing the Vale House's narrative, that order required sacrifice, that some people were meant to stand closer to the fire. Of the moment they realized the house did not distinguish between protection and control. "I stayed longer than I should have," the figure said, "because leaving meant admitting I'd helped build this." The confession was not dramatic. That was what made it powerful. It carried the weight of long-held restraint finally released. The protagonist listened, not interrupting. In that moment, pretense dissolved. There was no strategist and operative, only two people standing inside the consequences of systems larger than themselves. "I didn't tell you before," the figure continued, "because trust given too early becomes leverage." "And now?" the protagonist asked. "Now it becomes risk." That was the shift. What sparked between them was not romance, but intensity. A shared urgency that felt almost combustible. A recognition that what they were facing could not be navigated alone, and that honesty, once offered, could not be withdrawn. The doubt followed immediately. If the figure had once believed in the house, could they again? If the protagonist's path had been anticipated from the start, Could any future choice truly be free? The archives seemed to close in around them, not physically but emotionally. Knowledge pressed from all sides, demanding response. "We can't unknow this," the protagonist said. "No," the figure agreed. "And the house knows that too." That was the final twist of the blade. This revelation was not an accident. It was a test, a midpoint designed to force alignment or fracture. The Vale House would be watching what came next. As they prepared to leave, the figure paused, placing the record back where it had been hidden. "Whatever happens," they said, "we decide it together or not at all." The words carried both promise and warning. The protagonist nodded, feeling the weight of choice settle fully for the first time. Not the illusion of choice offered by the house, but the real thing, messy, dangerous, and uncertain. They ascended from the archives changed. What had begun as a careful alliance had crossed into something deeper. Shared vulnerability, shared stakes, shared doubt. The connection between them now burned brighter, fueled by truth rather than necessity. At the midpoint of the story, the veil had not merely lifted. It had torn, and nothing on the other side could be ignored. The summons arrived without warning and without explanation, as most things of consequence did in the city. No seal, no signature, only a time, a place, and the unspoken certainty that refusal would be remembered. The court convened at dawn. It always did. The building itself rose from the city's central square like an accusation carved in stone, symmetrical, immaculate, and deliberately impersonal. Its steps had been worn smooth by generations of petitioners who arrived hopeful and left altered. Above the entrance, banners hung motionless, their symbols abstract enough to imply justice without ever defining it. The protagonist stood at the base of the steps, feeling smaller than they had in weeks. Preparation had given them tools. Revelation had given them resolve. But the court dealt in neither. It dealt in appearances. Inside, the air was cold and thin. Sound carried too far, magnifying every footstep, every breath. Rows of seats curved toward a raised dais where figures sat partially obscured by architecture and light, visible enough to be seen, distant enough to remain untouchable. This was not a trial in the traditional sense. No charges were read aloud. No defense formally offered. The court's purpose was not to determine guilt, but to reaffirm narrative. And the narrative was already written. The protagonist was questioned obliquely. Not what did you do, but where were you when this occurred? Not who told you, but why would you need to know? Each inquiry was a net, not a blade, designed to entangle rather than cut. Answers were weighed not for truth, but for usefulness. Across the chamber, representatives of the Vale House observed from sanctioned positions. Their presence was subtle, but unmistakable. This was their terrain as much as the court's. The protagonist felt the dual pressure acutely. Speak too carefully and appear evasive. Speak too plainly and reveal too much. Frustration simmered. They realized, with a sinking clarity, that the court did not want resolution. It wanted compliance. The process itself was the punishment, a slow erosion of confidence, a public narrowing of options. When the figure, the one who had shared the truth in the archives, was called to speak, the tension sharpened. Their testimony was precise, restrained, and devastatingly incomplete. They did not lie. They simply did not protect. Each omission landed like a quiet betrayal, harder to challenge because it was technically correct. The protagonists searched their expression for explanation, for hesitation, for anything that suggested resistance. There was none. The court recessed without verdict or closure. It never offered either when uncertainty could do more damage. Outside, the city resumed its careful rhythms. The square filled with movement, voices, commerce. Life continuing as if nothing had shifted. The protagonist felt detached from it all, as though the trial had pushed them just far enough out of alignment to make everything feel unreal. When they finally confronted the figure, it was not with anger, but exhaustion. "You could have said more," the protagonist said quietly. "Yes," the figure replied, "and then neither of us would be here tomorrow." The logic was sound. That made it worse. What followed was not an argument, but a fracture. Trust, once cracked, does not break cleanly, it splinters. The protagonists found themselves questioning every prior exchange, every shared silence. Had the confession in the archives been another calculated risk? Another maneuver? The Vale House pressed in from all sides. Assignments arrived with shorter timelines and higher stakes. Requests blurred into demands. The message was clear: you are compromised. Prove your value. Frustration hardened into something heavier. The protagonist began to make mistakes, not of competence but of judgment. They hesitated where decisiveness was required. They pushed back where subtlety was safer. Each misstep compounded the sense of inevitability, the feeling of being guided toward an outcome they could no longer influence. Isolation returned, sharper than before because it followed connection. In the quiet after the court's shadow receded, despair crept in, not as collapse, but as narrowing. The future seemed to shrink to a corridor with no doors. Every option led to loss. The only question was how much. They wondered if the Vale House had been right from the beginning. If predictability was not a flaw but a function. If resistance only served to validate the system's expectations. The figure tried to bridge the distance once, carefully. "This isn't over," they said. "It feels decided," the protagonist replied. "Decided isn't the same as finished." The words failed to land. Hope, once strained too far, rebounds painfully or not at all. As night fell, the city's lights came on one by one, orderly and indifferent. Somewhere within that order, plans were being adjusted, records amended, futures negotiated without consent. The court had not condemned the protagonist. It had done something far more effective. It had made them doubt their own capacity to endure. And in that doubt, the shadows deepened, thick with betrayal, silence, and the slow pull of despair. After the court, the city no longer resisted the protagonist. It absorbed them. They moved through streets that once felt constricting and now felt indifferent. Doors opened when expected, closed when necessary. No one followed. No one warned. The absence of pressure was itself a verdict. The Vale House went silent. No instructions. No fragments of truth. No carefully timed interventions. Days passed without summons or signals, and the lack of contact carried a clear message. You are no longer essential. Isolation returned, not as fear, but as erasure. The protagonist realized that much of what they had taken for progress had been momentum borrowed from others. Without the house's attention, without shared preparation, without the figure beside them, their world flattened. The layers of meaning they had learned to read faded back into ordinary surfaces. The illusion of agency cracked. They revisited places tied to their recent work, searching for confirmation that it had mattered. The market stalls bustled as before. The routes they had monitored adjusted seamlessly, compensating for their absence. Whatever disruption they had caused had already been absorbed by the system. The city had adapted. That realization hollowed something deep inside. It suggested that resistance had not failed. It had never truly registered. At night, the protagonist sat alone, replaying every decision that had brought them here. Not with anger, but with a quiet, relentless scrutiny. They examined their motives the way the court examined testimony. Not for justification, but for weakness. Had they mistaken desperation for courage? Had the Vale House seen this outcome from the start? Anticipated the point at which they would falter, doubt, withdraw? The thought was unbearable, not because it implied manipulation, but because it implied accuracy. Perhaps they were predictable. The figure's absence cut deeper than expected. Not because of what had been lost, but because of what it had briefly promised. Understanding without agenda. That promise now felt naive. The confession in the archives replayed differently in memory, less like trust, more like preparation for abandonment. Hope, once extended, is harder to retrieve than ignorance. The protagonist confronted an uncomfortable truth. Much of their resolve had been sustained by proximity to others, by shared purpose, shared silence, shared risk. Alone, stripped of those anchors, they felt the full weight of uncertainty. Who were they without the house's attention? Without the court's opposition? Without someone watching closely enough for their actions to matter? The question echoed unanswered. This was the abyss, not a single catastrophic event, but a slow erosion of meaning. A sense that the story they thought they were in had moved on without them. That their role, whatever it had been, was complete. In that stillness, self-confrontation became unavoidable. They acknowledged the part of themselves that had wanted to be chosen. Not for power or recognition, but for confirmation that they were necessary. That their endurance, their caution, their invisibility had purpose. The realization was devastating. I wanted it to mean something, they admitted aloud, the words barely audible in the empty room. The city did not respond. The illusions fell away one by one. That truth was always hidden and simply needed uncovering. That institutions could be reasoned with. That alliances, once formed, naturally deepened into loyalty. What remained was stark and unadorned. Systems did not change because individuals understood them. They changed when individuals acted despite understanding the cost. And the cost, the protagonist now saw clearly, was loneliness. Not temporary isolation, but the sustained willingness to stand without affirmation. This understanding did not restore hope. It stripped it down. The abyss offered no comfort, no revelation that made the suffering worthwhile. It offered only clarity. No one was coming to resolve this for them. No unseen structure would validate their choices. Any next step would have to be taken without assurance of success or acknowledgement. For a long while, the protagonists did nothing. They existed in suspension, letting the weight of that truth settle fully. They did not distract themselves. They did not seek reassurance. They allowed the hopelessness to be felt, not indulged, but endured. And slowly, something unexpected occurred. The despair stopped deepening. It did not lift, but it stabilized. At the bottom of the abyss, there was nothing left to lose. Not reputation, not favor, not belonging. The city had already taken those. The Vale House had withdrawn them. The court had redefined them. What remained was choice, bare, unadorned, and finally free of illusion. The protagonists did not yet know what they would do with that freedom. But for the first time since entering the Vale House, they understood that whatever came next would not be anticipated, cultivated or approved. It would be theirs. The abyss did not answer back, but it stopped beckoning. Renewal did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as irritation. The protagonist noticed it first in small moments, in the way their thoughts no longer spiraled endlessly around the same doubts, in the way the city's indifference began to feel less like judgment and more like opportunity. The absence of oversight, once suffocating, now revealed gaps, spaces where attention did not reach, corridors of neglect. The system had looked away. That, they realized, was a mistake. With nothing left to preserve, the protagonist began to observe again, not as a conduit for the Vale House, not as a subject of the court, but as an individual unburdened by expectation. The city resumed its familiar patterns, and familiarity bred insight. They saw how enforcement lagged behind declaration, how narratives were maintained only where someone cared enough to maintain them, how silence, once imposed, could be repurposed. The first realization was simple and unsettling. The system was powerful, but it was not precise. It relied on momentum, on people behaving as anticipated. The second realization followed naturally. Unpredictability was not chaos, it was leverage. The protagonist began to act in small, deniable ways. Not rebellion, not exposure, adjustments, minor interventions that redirected outcomes without announcing intent. A warning delivered anonymously. A record misfiled just enough to delay action. A conversation steered away from assumption and toward doubt. Nothing dramatic, everything cumulative. The city did not react. Encouraged, the protagonist tested further. Each action was measured, reversible if necessary. They were no longer proving value to anyone else. They were testing alignment with their own limits, their own judgment. This was the forge. Repetition under pressure, refining intent. It was during one such moment, an exchange that required precise timing, that the figure reappeared. Not dramatically, not apologetically, simply present. They stood at the edge of a quiet thoroughfare, watching the same intersection the protagonist had been monitoring. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was no longer fragile. It was deliberate. "You didn't disappear," the figure said at last. "No," the protagonist replied. "I stopped waiting." The answer landed between them, heavy with implication. The figure did not ask what had changed. They had likely already deduced it. Instead, they offered something rarer than explanation. Choice. "I'm no longer aligned with the house," they said. Not covertly, not strategically, fully. The words were not a plea. They were a statement of consequence. "You know what that costs," the protagonist said. "Yes," the figure replied. "That's why I'm saying it now." This was not a return to old alliance. It was a redefinition. They compared what they knew, not pooling secrets but mapping uncertainties. Each gap became a point of inquiry rather than frustration. They did not seek a perfect plan. They sought resilience. The renewed alliance formed differently from before. No implied hierarchy. No expectation of protection. Only shared intent and clearly defined limits. Trust was not assumed. It was constructed. The emotional shift was subtle but profound. Where earlier connection had been fueled by proximity and necessity, this one was grounded in agency. Each chose to remain, not because they were cornered, but because they believed action still mattered. Hope returned not as belief in success, but as belief in meaning. "We won't dismantle the system," the figure said. "Not quickly." "I know," the protagonist replied. but we can fracture its certainty. That was enough. They began to prepare, not as operatives, but as disruptors of expectation. They identified a convergence point where the court, the Vale House, and the city's narrative machinery intersected. Not a single dramatic event, but a process dependent on silence and compliance. The plan was not elegant. It was human. It relied on timing, on imperfect information, on people choosing differently when presented with alternatives they had never been offered. It accepted risk without glorifying it. For the first time, the protagonist felt aligned not with outcome but with action. The forge burned steady. There were moments of doubt. There always would be, but doubt no longer paralyzed. It informed. It sharpened questions instead of eroding resolve. On the eve of execution, not a strike, but an exposure of process, the protagonist paused, considering the path that had led here. The Vale House, the court, the abyss, none of it had been wasted. It had stripped away illusion until only intent remained. They looked at the figure beside them, not as savior, not as liability, but as witness. "Whatever happens," the protagonist said, echoing words once spoken in the archives. "This is chosen." The figure nodded. "That's the difference." The city slept, unaware that its careful narratives were about to be tested, not by force, but by refusal to behave as expected. The spark had caught. The forge had done its work. What came next would not be clean or certain, but it would be deliberate. And for the first time since the whispers began, the protagonist stepped forward not because the abyss demanded it, but because they were ready. The city gathered itself for certainty. It always did when threatened, not with alarm but with ceremony. Processes accelerated. Announcements were prepared. The court convened under the pretense of restoration, and the Vale House moved quietly to ensure outcomes remained contained. Order was about to be reaffirmed. What none of them accounted for was refusal. The detonation did not begin with exposure or accusation. It began with interruption, a delay where none was expected. A document surfaced in the wrong sequence. A witness was redirected, not silenced, but heard. Small fractures appeared across the system's polished surface, not enough to shatter it, but enough to make it visible. The protagonist moved through the convergence point like a shadow among shadows, no longer hiding but choosing when to be seen. Every step was intentional, every risk measured against purpose rather than survival. This was not revenge. This was reckoning. The court attempted to regain narrative control, issuing clarifications that contradicted one another. The Vale House tried to close ranks, only to discover that its intermediaries no longer moved in unison. The system's greatest strength, predictability, turned against it. The figure stood beside the protagonist at the fulcrum of it all, no longer apart, no longer hesitant. Their shared resolve did not erase doubt, but it rendered doubt irrelevant. Action had replaced speculation. When confrontation came, it was not theatrical. It was undeniable. A record was read aloud, not as accusation but as continuity. A chain of decisions traced cleanly, without embellishment. Names were not emphasized. Processes were. The architecture of control stood exposed, stripped of abstraction. The court responded as it always had, with authority. "You misunderstand your position," a voice declared. "You are not empowered to decide this." The protagonist stepped forward. "That's the illusion," they said calmly. "That power only exists where it's assigned." The words landed with more force than any threat, not because they challenged authority, but because they revealed its dependency. The system required belief, compliance, participation, and those were no longer guaranteed. The twist arrived not as betrayal, but as convergence. Others stepped forward. Not heroes, not rebels, but people long positioned at the edges. Clerks, observers, intermediaries, individuals who had learned the cost of silence and chosen, at last, to redirect it. The Vale House fractured publicly, not into enemies, but into irreconcilable truths. Some clung to control. Others withdrew, unwilling to defend what could no longer be justified. The crown of shadows, authority sustained by obscurity, cracked. What followed was not chaos. It was release. The emotional catharsis did not come from watching the system fall, but from watching inevitability fail. From realizing that the future was no longer prescripted. That resistance had not been futile, it had been cumulative. The protagonist felt it then. Not triumph over others, but triumph over the narrative that had once defined them as predictable, invisible, expendable. They were none of those things now. The figure met their gaze across the aftermath. Not smiling, not celebrating. Simply present. Witness to the transformation they had both chosen at cost without guarantee. The city would change slowly, painfully, incompletely, but it would change. As dawn broke across the stone spires and quiet streets, light touched places it had not reached before, not because darkness had been destroyed, but because it no longer ruled unchallenged. The story did not end with certainty. It ended with possibility. And if you're teetering on this precipice of transformation, hit subscribe now, because the dawn breaking through these shadows will redefine everything you thought possible. The city did not wake up transformed. It woke up cautious. Morning light spilled across the streets as it always had, catching on stone and glass, illuminating markets being assembled and doors unlocking in careful sequence. To an untrained eye, nothing had changed. Order still existed. Systems still functioned. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The city remembered. Not everything, institutions never do, but enough. Enough to hesitate. Enough to question patterns once accepted without thought. The crown of shadows had fractured, and though its pieces remained embedded in the architecture of power, they no longer fit together seamlessly. Gaps had formed. Into those gaps flowed possibility. The court resumed its sessions, but its language softened. Processes were re-examined, not dismantled, but exposed to scrutiny they had long evaded. The Vale House withdrew from prominence, splintering into quieter, more accountable roles. Some members disappeared entirely, unwilling to adapt. Others stayed, changed by necessity. The system endured, but no longer unquestioned. The protagonist moved through this altered landscape with a new awareness. They were no longer invisible, yet they were not elevated to symbol or savior. Their role had shifted from catalyst to participant. Someone who understood how fragile narratives were, and how carefully they must be handled. Growth, they realized, was not about becoming larger. It was about becoming clearer. They returned to places that had once felt oppressive and found them neutral now, uncharged by fear or expectation. The market where they had once listened in silence now buzzed with conversations edged with curiosity. The quiet corridors they had navigated alone now held echoes of shared purpose. Subplots resolved themselves not through dramatic revelation, but through continuity. Those who had stepped forward during the reckoning did not retreat. They stayed engaged, forming informal networks that valued transparency over control. Information moved differently now, not freely but responsibly. Silence was no longer the default response to uncertainty. The protagonist contributed where they could, not as an intermediary, but as a steward of attention. They knew when to speak, when to listen, and, most importantly, when to step back and let others act. Agency, once so elusive, had become sustainable. The figure remained, not as a shadowed counterpart, not as a constant presence, but as a chosen ally whose path intersected naturally rather than forcibly. Their connection no longer relied on crisis. It rested on shared values and mutual respect, strengthened, not consumed by what they had survived. They spoke openly now, not about everything, but about enough, about lessons learned, about boundaries clarified, about the quiet satisfaction of choosing alignment over advantage. Joy surfaced unexpectedly, not as celebration but as fulfillment. The protagonist felt it in moments of stillness, watching the city at dusk, sensing its rhythms without fear, in conversations that no longer required coded language, in the realization that they could imagine a future without first calculating its risks. The bindings formed through the story, the alliances, the truths, the choices, proved eternal not because they were unbreakable, but because they had been chosen consciously. They could evolve without dissolving. They could endure disagreement without reverting to control. That was the true inheritance of the dawn. The story closed not on an ending, but on a beginning already in motion. A city learning to live with awareness. Individuals discovering that courage was not a single act, but a practice. A protagonist who no longer needed to be chosen because they had chosen themselves. As the light strengthened and the shadows receded into their proper places, the future opened. Not flawless, not guaranteed, but honest. And in that honesty there was hope, a quiet, lasting hope, strong enough to build upon.